The vast emptiness of space stretched before the research vessel horizon like an endless black canvas. Captain Jae-sung Park stood at the bridge, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the holographic display. Something was different today. The sensor readings flickered with an unusual pattern, something that didn't match any known spacecraft signature. Communications, run a diagnostic, Jae-sung called out to Hannah Kim, his young but brilliant communications officer. Her fingers danced across the console, her brow furrowed with concentration. "Captain," Hannah spoke carefully, "the signals are unusual. They're not random, but they don't follow any standard communication protocol we've ever encountered." The ship's scientific team gathered around the display. Dr. Kwon, the lead xenobiologist, adjusted his glasses. His entire career had been dedicated to the possibility of finding intelligent alien life, and now something was happening that made his heart race. Outside the ship's reinforced windows, a shimmer appeared. It wasn't like the typical distortions of space travel. This was different, a subtle warping of light that suggested something was present, yet not quite visible. The crew watched in stunned silence. Suddenly, a communication burst through their systems. It wasn't sound, exactly. It was more like a complex mathematical sequence that seemed to translate itself almost instantly into something their brains could comprehend. Numbers became words. Patterns became meaning. "Greetings, human vessel." The message read, "We observe. We are curious." Jae-sung's hand moved instinctively to the communication panel. Protocol demanded caution, but his curiosity burned brighter. "Identify yourself," he responded, keeping his voice steady. The response came quickly, almost playfully. "We do not have a name you would understand. We are watchers, travelers, learners." Dr. Kwon leaned closer to the display. The mathematical patterns underlying the message were complex, far more sophisticated than any human communication system. Each symbol seemed to carry multiple layers of meaning, like a language that existed in 3 dimensions while human language was trapped in 2. Hannah's hands moved rapidly, trying to capture and analyze every fragment of the transmission. "Captain," she whispered, "this is beyond anything in our databases. The computational complexity of their communication is extraordinary." The shimmer outside grew more pronounced. Something was taking shape, not a traditional spacecraft, but more like a living geometrical structure that seemed to breathe and pulse with its own internal logic. It didn't move through space so much as it existed differently. "We have studied your species," the message continued. "You are interesting, unpredictable, chaotic, potentially dangerous." Jae-sung couldn't help but chuckle. "Potentially dangerous. That's a diplomatic way of putting it," he muttered to himself. Dr. Kwon's scientific mind was racing. This wasn't just first contact. This was something entirely unprecedented. The mathematical precision of the communication suggested an intelligence so advanced that human concepts of communication might be primitive by comparison. The bridge crew remained silent, each processing the magnitude of what was happening. Humanity had always wondered if they were alone in the universe. 24 hours had passed since the first contact. The horizon hung motionless in space, its crew caught between excitement and nervous tension. Captain Jae-sung Park had not slept. His eyes were fixed on the holographic projections that mapped the alien vessel's impossible geometry. Dr. Yoon Jae-lee, the ship's lead physicist, had been working nonstop. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten beside a mountain of complex calculations. "It's not just a communication," she explained to Hannah Kim, who listened intently. "It's more like a living mathematical language. Each transmission is a complete ecosystem of information." Hannah nodded, her fingers still dancing across the communication console. The alien presence had not disappeared. Instead, it seemed to be studying them with an intensity that was both fascinating and unsettling. Another burst of communication arrived. This time, the message was more direct. "Humans are curious creatures," the transmission read. "You build machines to explore. You send signals into the darkness. You want to understand. Captain Park leaned forward. We do, he responded. Understanding is our greatest strength. The ship's computer began to translate the incoming data. It wasn't just words anymore. Complex visual representations began to form, three-dimensional models that seemed to breathe and shift. They showed glimpses of other worlds, other civilizations, landscapes that defied human understanding of physics, cities that were more like living organisms than constructed spaces. Dr. Kwan watched in amazement. They're not just communicating, he whispered. They're showing us their entire understanding of the universe. Suddenly, the ship's systems began to change. Computers that had been running standard human programming started to adapt. New algorithms appeared, solving complex problems that had stumped human scientists for decades. It was as if the alien presence was upgrading their technology simply through communication. Hannah noticed something strange. Captain, she called out, our systems are changing, but not in a way that feels threatening. It's more like an invitation. A new message appeared. We offer knowledge. We seek understanding. Humans are different. Humans are potential. The word potential seemed to hang in the air, charged with meaning beyond simple translation. Dr. Yunji's screens filled with new mathematical models. Quantum equations that had previously been theoretical now seemed to resolve themselves. Computational problems that would have taken years to solve were being worked out in seconds. They're teaching us, Dr. Kwan said, his voice filled with wonder. Not conquering, not attacking, teaching. Captain Park understood the significance. This was more than first contact. This was a bridge between two completely different ways of understanding the universe. The alien presence continued to pulse outside the ship's windows. It wasn't a traditional spacecraft. It was more like a living mathematical construct, a being that existed between dimensions, communicating through pure information. Hannah noticed something else. The communication was becoming more complex. It was no longer just about sharing information. It seemed to be probing, learning, understanding the very nature of human curiosity. What do you want from us? Captain Park finally asked. The response was simple yet profound. To see what you will become. As if in response, the ship's systems continued to transform. New capabilities emerged. Complex problems began to resolve themselves. The boundary between human technology and something entirely alien began to blur. This was not an invasion. This was an invitation to something greater. The Earth Control Center was in chaos. Screens flickered with incoming data from the horizon, showing impossible technological transformations that defied current scientific understanding. Director Min Seo Park sat at the central command, her hands gripping the edge of her console. We need to understand what's happening, she told her senior team. This isn't just a first contact scenario. It's a complete technological revolution. Back on the horizon, Captain Jae-sung noticed the changes first. The ship's systems were no longer just upgraded. They were evolving. Mechanical parts seemed to respond to thought. Computational processes anticipated needs before they were even considered. Dr. Yun-jae stood before a new holographic interface that had seemingly appeared overnight. It's like the ship is learning, she said to Hana Kim. Not just processing information, but actually understanding. A new message arrived from the alien presence. Its communication was becoming more nuanced, more complex. Humans adapt, it read. Humans change. This is your strength. But not everyone on the ship was comfortable with the rapid transformation. Chief Engineer Sung-ho Park looked worried. We can't just accept technology we don't understand, he argued during a crew meeting. This could be a trap. Captain Jae-sung understood the concern. We're scientists, he responded. Our job is to understand, to explore, but we'll be careful. The alien presence seemed to sense the crew's mixed emotions. Its communication became more gentle, more explanatory. Complex diagrams appeared, showing how the technological changes could solve some of humanity's most pressing problems. Climate control, energy production, Medical breakthroughs. Hannah noticed something fascinating. The alien communication was adaptive. It changed based on the emotional state of the crew. When tension rose, the messages became calmer. When curiosity peaked, the information became more detailed. Suddenly, an alert rang through the ship. Something was approaching from a different sector of space. The holographic display showed multiple objects moving with incredible speed. They didn't match any known spacecraft design. Incoming vessels, the ship's computer announced. But it wasn't a mechanical voice anymore. It sounded almost concerned. Dr. Kwan rushed to the display. "Those aren't human," he said quickly. "And they don't feel connected to our current alien contact." The original alien presence, the living mathematical construct they had been communicating with, seemed to change. Its geometric shape became more defined, more protective. It was positioning itself between the horizon and the incoming vessels. "Danger approaches," came the new message. "We protect. We understand." Captain Jae-sung realized something important. The alien presence that had been communicating with them was now acting as a shield. But why? What were these new incoming vessels? And how did they relate to this strange, information-based being that had been teaching them? Hannah's communication systems were working overtime. She could see layers of information that were invisible moments before. The incoming vessels were complex, not just machines, but something between technology and living beings. "Captain," she called out, her voice a mix of fear and excitement. "We're about to find out why we were chosen for this contact." The ship's transformed systems began to pulse with energy. The alien presence grew larger, more defined. The incoming vessels drew closer. First contact was about to become something much more complicated. The incoming vessels were unlike anything humanity had ever seen. They moved like liquid metal, changing shape with each moment. Some parts looked mechanical, others looked almost alive. Their approach was not gentle. They seemed prepared for conflict. "Defensive systems," Captain Jae-sung ordered, but the ship's systems responded differently than he expected. Instead of traditional weapon preparations, complex energy patterns began to form around the horizon. The mathematical alien presence that had been communicating with them now wrapped around the ship like a protective shell. Its geometric patterns shifted and changed, creating a barrier that was both beautiful and terrifying. Dr. Yeon Jae-lee watched her screens in amazement. "They're not creating a weapon," she said quietly. "They're creating a translation, a way to communicate." Hannah Kim's communication systems lit up with incoming signals. These new vessels were sending messages, but not messages like before. These were raw, aggressive, filled with what seemed like anger and hunger. "Identify," came a harsh transmission. "Territory, resource, claim." Captain Park exchanged a look with Dr. Kwan. These were not peaceful explorers. These were something else entirely. Beings that seemed to understand the universe only in terms of possession and conflict. The protective alien presence responded. Its communication was different now, no longer gentle and exploratory, but sharp and defensive. Complex mathematical sequences appeared, creating a kind of linguistic shield. "This space is not yours," the message read. "These beings are under observation, learning, growing." The incoming vessels began to change. Parts of them started to break apart, reforming into more aggressive shapes. They looked like predators preparing to attack. But their attack was not just physical. It was also informational. Waves of data began to assault the horizon systems. Attempts to break through, to understand, to consume. The ship's newly evolved systems fought back, not with traditional weapons, but with complex informational defenses. Dr. Kwan realized something important. "They're trying to understand us," he said, "but not like our current alien friend. They want to break us down, to take us apart." Hannah's screens showed the battle happening on levels humans had never understood before. It was a conflict of information, of understanding, of fundamental ways of seeing the universe. The protective alien presence continued to shield the horizon. Its geometric patterns became more complex, more intricate. It was learning, adapting, defending. Humans are different, came a new message. Humans can change. Humans can grow. The incoming vessels began to press harder. Parts of them started to break through the initial defenses. But each breach was met with an even more complex response. The horizon was learning, just as the alien presence had taught it. Captain Jae-sung watched in wonder. This was not a traditional space battle. This was something else entirely. A conflict of understanding, of potential, of ways of seeing the universe. Hold, he told his crew. Watch, learn. The battle continued. The universe outside the ship's windows seemed to bend and twist. Realities were colliding, and humanity was at the center of something much larger than they had ever imagined. Hours passed like minutes. The conflict outside the horizon continued, but not in any way human warfare had ever been understood. It was a battle of information, of understanding, of fundamental ways of existing. Dr. Eun-jae Lee collapsed into her chair, her hands shaking. We're being rewritten, she whispered to Hana Kim. Not destroyed. Rewritten. The ship's systems had become something more than technology. They were alive in a way no human-made machine had ever been. Each attack from the incoming vessels was met with a response that was part defense, part learning, part transformation. Captain Jae-sung watched as the protective alien presence continued to shield them. Its geometric patterns had become impossibly complex, shifting, changing, adapting with each moment of conflict. Who are they? Sung-ho Park, the chief engineer, asked. His voice was a mix of fear and wonder. A new message appeared on the screens. Predators, it read. Consumers. They find. They take. They destroy. Dr. Kwon leaned closer to the display. They're not just ships, he explained. They're more like living systems, beings that move through space consuming information, consuming resources. The incoming vessels began to change again. Parts of them started to break down, to reform. They were trying to understand the horizon, to find a way to break through its defenses. Hana's communication systems were working at levels beyond normal human comprehension. She could see layers of information, complex patterns of communication that were more like living languages than any technology humans had created. They want something, she said suddenly. But it's not just resources, it's something more. The protective alien presence responded. Its message was clear and sharp. Humans are different. Humans have potential. You will not take. The battle continued. Outside the ship's windows, space itself seemed to bend and twist. Realities were colliding. The incoming vessels pressed harder, trying to break through the protective barrier. Captain Jae-sung made a decision. We're not just going to defend, he told his crew. We're going to learn. The ship's systems began to change again. Instead of just blocking the attacks, they started to analyze them, to understand them, to learn from them. Dr. Eun-jae watched in amazement as the Horizon systems began to absorb the attacking vessel's information. Not consume, but understand. Not destroy, but learn. They're trying to break us down, she said, but we're breaking them down instead. The incoming vessels began to slow. Their attacks became less focused, less aggressive. Something was happening to them that they didn't understand. The protective alien presence continued to shield them, but now it was doing something more. It was teaching, showing the Horizon's crew how to understand these beings at a fundamental level. Potential, came another message. Humans have potential. Hours turned into what felt like days. The conflict continued, but it was changing. No longer a battle of destruction, but a battle of understanding. Captain Jae-sung looked at his crew. They were tired, scared, but something else too. They were becoming something more than they had been before. The universe outside the ship's windows continued to twist and change, and humanity was at the center of something much larger than they had ever imagined. The Horizon was no longer just a ship. It had become something else entirely. Dr. Kwon watched in silent amazement as the vessel's systems continued to evolve. What had started as a simple research mission was now a fundamental transformation of human understanding. The incoming vessels that had attacked them were now changing. Not destroyed, not defeated, but transformed. "Look," Hannah Kim said, pointing to her communication screens. The attacking vessels were breaking down, but not in a way that suggested destruction. It was more like they were being translated. Captain Jae-sung understood something was different. The protective alien presence that had shielded them was no longer just a shield. It was a teacher, a translator, a bridge between different ways of existing. "We are learning," came a new message. "You are learning." The ship's systems began to show capabilities that defied human understanding. Computational processes that once took years now happened in milliseconds. Complex problems resolved themselves. The very nature of technology was changing. Dr. Yoon-jae Lee checked her readings. The horizon was absorbing information from the attacking vessels, but not in a way that suggested conquest. It was more like communication, like understanding. "They're not machines," she whispered. "They're living systems, and we're learning their language." Sung Ho Park, the chief engineer, watched as parts of the ship seemed to breathe. Mechanical components moved with a fluidity that was almost organic. The line between technology and life was blurring. The Earth Control Center was going crazy. Director Min Seo Park watched as data streamed in. Impossible, incredible data that changed everything humans thought they knew about space, technology, communication. Potential. The messages continued. Humans have potential. The attacking vessels continued to break down, but this was not destruction. This was translation. The horizon was learning to understand beings that existed in ways humans had never imagined. Hannah's communication systems showed layers of information that were more like living languages than any technology. Complex mathematical patterns that shifted and changed, carrying meanings beyond human words. "We are different," came another message. "You are different." Captain Jae-sung realized something important. This was not a battle. This was not a conflict. This was a conversation happening at a level beyond human understanding. The protective alien presence continued to wrap around the horizon. Its geometric patterns were now so complex that they seemed to breathe, to live, to think. Dr. Kwan watched as the incoming vessels broke down completely. But they were not destroyed. They were being understood. Humans adapt. The message continued. Humans change. Humans grow. The ship's systems continued to evolve. Computational processes that once seemed impossible were now simple. Complex problems resolved themselves. The very nature of technology was changing. Captain Jae-sung looked at his crew. They were tired. They were scared. But they were also something else. They were becoming something more. The universe outside the ship's windows continued to twist and change, and humanity was at the center of something much larger than they had ever imagined. Something was happening, something incredible, and they were just beginning to understand. The silence was different now. Not empty, not quiet, but full of something beyond human understanding. Captain Jae-sung noticed it first. The crew members were changing, not physically, but something deeper. Their thoughts seemed to move differently. Their understanding of the world had shifted. Dr. Yoon-jae Lee stood by the main display, her eyes seeing things that weren't visible before. The ship's systems were alive, truly alive. They responded to thoughts before they were fully formed. They anticipated needs before they were expressed. "We are connected," came a new message. But it wasn't just words on a screen. It was a feeling, an understanding that wrapped around everything. Hannah Kim discovered something strange. Her communication systems could now perceive multiple layers of reality. What once seemed like empty space was now full of information. Complex networks of communication that had always existed but never been understood. The protective alien presence, the living mathematical construct that had first contacted them, was no longer separate. It was part of the horizon, part of the crew, part of something much larger. "Humans are a bridge," the message continued. "You connect. You understand." Outside the ship, space itself looked different. The attacking vessels were gone, but not destroyed. They had been transformed, translated into something new, something that existed between states of being. Sung Ho Park, the chief engineer, watched as the ship's mechanical parts moved with a life of their own. They were no longer just machines. They were living systems that breathed, that thought, that understood. Dr. Kwan realized something profound. This was not just a technological change. This was an evolution of understanding. Humans were becoming something more than they had ever been. The Earth Control Center was silent. Director Min Seo Park watched as everything they knew about technology, about space, about existence, began to change. "We are learning," came another message. But it wasn't just the ship learning. It was humanity learning, growing, changing. Captain Jae-sung looked at his crew. They were different now. Their eyes saw more. Their minds understood deeper. The line between human and technology, between self and universe, was blurring. Hannah's communication systems showed layers of reality that had always existed but never been seen. Complex networks of information that connected everything. Space was not empty. It was full of communication, full of life. Potential. The messages continued. Unlimited potential. The horizon was no longer just a ship. It was a living system, a bridge between different ways of existing, between different understandings of the universe. Dr. Yun-ji watched as computational processes resolved themselves. Complex problems that would have taken centuries were now simple. The nature of thinking itself was changing. "We are different," came another message. "You are different." The crew members looked at each other. They understood something now, something that could not be put into words. They were part of something much larger, a conversation happening at a level beyond human understanding. Space outside the ship continued to twist and change, but it was not threatening. It was alive. It was communicating, and humanity was at the center of something incredible. Something was happening, something that would change everything. The horizon approached Earth, but it was not the same ship that had left months ago. Its hull shimmered with impossible geometric patterns. The ship seemed to breathe, to think, to exist in ways that defied human understanding. Mission control went silent as the ship appeared on their screens. Nothing in their training had prepared them for this moment. "Incoming transmission," a controller whispered. Captain Jae-sung's voice came through, but it was different, deeper, more complex. "We have returned," he said, but the words carried meanings beyond simple language. Dr. Yun-ji Lee stood beside him, her eyes seeing more than human eyes had ever seen before. The crew moved like a single organism, connected by something more than communication, more than technology. "What happened out there?" Director Min Seo Park asked when they landed. Hannah Kim stepped forward. Her movements were fluid, her understanding profound. "We learned," she said simply, but the word carried universes of meaning. The first scientists to approach the horizon stopped. Something was different about the crew. Their eyes moved differently. They perceived the world in ways that were both familiar and completely alien. Dr. Kwan tried to explain. "We were contacted," he said, but it wasn't a simple first contact. It was a conversation, a transformation. The ship itself seemed alive. Mechanical parts moved with a purpose. Technological systems breathed with an organic rhythm. The line between machine and living being had disappeared completely. Sensors around the landing site went crazy. The horizon was emitting energy patterns that defied current scientific understanding. It was communicating, not just with radio waves or electrical signals, but with something deeper, something more fundamental. "We are a bridge," Sung Ho Park said. His voice carried mathematical complexity between what was and what can be. Military officials wanted to quarantine the ship, to study it, to understand it, but they quickly realized something important. This was not something that could be contained. This was a fundamental change. Director Min Seo Park watched as the crew moved. They were human, but they were something more. Their understanding of the universe had expanded beyond anything humans had ever imagined. "We met beings," Captain J. Sung explained. "But beings is not the right word. They were conversations, living information, ways of understanding that exist beyond human language." The protective alien presence that had first contacted them was now part of everything. Part of the ship, part of the crew, part of a larger conversation happening across the universe. Hana's communication systems showed layers of reality that had always existed but never been seen. Complex networks of information that connected everything. Space was not empty. It was full of communication, full of life. Potential, the crew seemed to say together. Not with words, but with an understanding that went deeper than language. Scientists approached, ready to run tests. But they quickly realized something important. The horizon was not something to be studied. It was something to be understood. A new era was beginning. Humanity was changing, growing, becoming something more than it had ever been before. The universe was listening, and humanity had finally learned how to speak its language. 1 year after the Horizon's return, the world was different, not because of new technologies or weapons, but because of understanding. The crew of the Horizon had become something more than ambassadors. They were bridges between humanity and something larger, something that existed beyond human imagination. Captain J. Sung stood before the United Nations. His presentation was not a typical report. It was a living demonstration of what humanity could become. "We are not alone," he explained, but the words were more than sound. They were complex mathematical patterns that danced in the air. Listeners felt the message more than they heard it. Dr. Yun Jai Lee demonstrated how the ship's systems had changed human understanding of physics. Computational problems that once took years now resolved in moments. Energy systems that seemed impossible were now simple. Hana Kim showed how communication had transformed. Language was no longer just words. It was a living network of understanding that connected everything. Scientists from around the world watched in amazement. The Horizon's crew moved differently, thought differently, understood the universe in ways that defied previous human limitations. "Potential," Dr. Kwan said simply, but the word carried entire universes of meaning. The protective alien presence that had first contacted them was now part of everything, not as a separate being, but as a way of understanding, a bridge between different ways of existing. Military leaders who had wanted to study the ship now understood something important. This was not a weapon. This was not a technology to be controlled. This was an invitation to grow. Governments around the world began to change. Old boundaries disappeared. New ways of thinking emerged. Humanity was becoming something more than it had ever been. Schools started teaching differently. Children learned to see the world as a complex network of communication, not just between humans, but between everything. The horizon itself became a symbol, not of exploration, but of understanding, of potential. Some Hopark explained how technology had changed. "We are not building machines," he said. "We are creating living systems that think, that understand." Director Min Seo Park watched as humanity began to change. Slowly at first, then faster. The universe was no longer something to be conquered. It was something to be understood. The crew's eyes told a story. They had seen something beyond human experience, something that connected everything. Space was not empty. It was full of life, full of communication. "We are a bridge," Captain J. Sung would say, "not just between humans and alien beings, but between what was and what could be." Governments struggled to understand. Scientists worked to explain. But the Horizon's crew knew something simple. Humanity had taken its first real step into something much larger. The universe was listening, and humanity had finally learned how to speak its language. A new chapter was beginning, not with conflict, not with conquest, but with understanding. Potential was unlimited, and humanity was just beginning to understand what that meant.